Welcome. In this clip, we continue discussion of the AS-AD system. On the screen, you can already see the AS-AD system so that you can follow that which parts we are just discussing. In the first part of this clip, we derived the AD already. Now we will look at the short-run and the long-run aggregate supply curves. Let's start with the long-run aggregate supply curve. The long-run aggregate supply curve is just going to give us the potential level of the GDP. So first let us discuss what is the potential level of GDP. Imagine the situation that you have an economy, and here we have a real output, and we look at the real output over time. Now you are going to find that there is a fluctuation around a positive trend. So you can say that this positive trend here is the potential output. This is when the economy uses its resources in the most efficient way. This potential output is going to be represented by the LRAS, and it will not depend on the price level. That's when we would normally say that in the long run, money is neutral. And this is part of the classical dichotomy, which just simply means that in the long run, the nominal and the real side of the economy are independent. In the short run, however, they are not. So actually there will be fluctuations along this long-run aggregate supply. And these fluctuations here, now these are going to be represented by changes in the AD or the SRAS. So that means basically that the economy in the long run is going to have an output which is determined by the technology in the economy. So basically this Y1 is nothing else than what you can produce with the current technology using the available factors of production. So this is the LRAS now. So let's assume that something happens with the LRAS and it increases, for example. Well, you can expect that productivity in the economy is going to increase year by year. So over time, you will see that simply technological development causes rightward shifts in the LRAS. So we started Y1, now we are at Y2, Y3. And we already had, of course, an AD. Now you can see basically the effect of economic growth on the GDP and the price level. So unless AD shifts, then you are going to get higher and higher levels of real output at a lower and lower price level. And this is what you could call as deflation. And unless you add additional demand into the economy by, for example, increasing the money supply in the economy, you will necessarily feel the effect of economic growth as a deflation. And look at then the quantity theory of money. Do you remember that basically this was exactly what we got? That we had here the inflation in the economy was nothing else than the rate of growth of the money supply minus economic growth. And actually this situation is exactly the same. Don't be surprised. In the long run, the economy works according to the neoclassical model, and the quantity theory of money, which we use to derive this particular equation here, is a neoclassical model. So what we do here is that with the LRAS and the AD, we can model the same situation what we could model with the quantity theory of money. And as you can see, what happens here is that because dm is 0, means that the AD remains the same as before. And that means that because y is going up, because dy is positive, yeah, we have a rightward shift here. For that reason, there must be necessarily a decrease in the price level. So what would you normally do? Normally, you would just simply add additional money supply in the economy, so you would just increase the liquidity in the economy, and then you could, for example, always just supply enough extra liquidity by monetary expansion, by shifting the AD more and more rightward, that actually the price level remains the same at higher levels of GDP. What usually therefore is necessary for central banks to do, that they should increase the amount of money in the circulation if the current bank system is not able to do so, so that the prices as a result of economic growth will not fall. In practice, however, they will of course make a higher monetary expansion so that economic growth happens with a small healthy level of inflation, which is about 2%. So now you see that what happens with the LRAS. Now, what could cause shifts in the LRAS? Here I already assumed that the shift in the LRAS will happen due to technology. Now, that's possible. New technologies, new innovations will increase the economy's ability to transform its resources to real output. So that will be a source of a constant shift in the LRAS, but other things may also happen. For example, a negative LRAS shock may happen if the country loses a large fraction of its capital stock. Now, this could happen as a result of a disaster or as a result of a war. So, during a war period, you could also say and make the hypothesis that this is where a war economy starts. And then initially there will be, of course, an increase in prices and so on. So initially, in the short run, the GDP will go up, and we are going to discuss why when looking at the short run aggregate supply. But once this war goes bad for this particular country and their area is being bombarded, they lose a lot of equipment and buildings, then they may actually experience a drop in the LRAS. So whenever the available level of capital and labor is decreasing, then that will also result in a shift of the LRAS to the left. Now, as a next step, let's look at the SRAS, and that's important because actually a lot of stuff could not be understood by using only the long-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand. So what is SRAS? It is positively sloped, which shows us that even though in the long run the output is independent of the prices, in the short run money is not neutral. That means that increasing prices may convince firms to produce more. Why? No, the firm's decision, not surprisingly, is based on its profit maximization principle. What is profit? Profit, well, I'm going to rather use here, I will just write here profit because we use pi in macroeconomics to denote the rate of inflation. So profit is nothing else than the total revenue. Well, in this case, actually, this is y itself minus the cost. And actually, in the short run, we will say that the capital is not changing, but firms can hire new workers or lay them off. So we are going to have a nominal wage times the labor employed in the economy minus the price of capital stocks or rental price of capital times K, and actually we will disregard this part, so we will just treat it as constant here. So what will be the effect of an increase in prices? There are two effects. First, there will be a direct increase in P. Now, of course, the firms are not perfectly informed. So if that is true, then they cannot really tell if that price increase they experience is due to some general inflation in the economy or whether the good is no more in demand. So they will basically mistake general inflation for an increase in demand for their own good. And this explanation is therefore an explanation based on imperfect information. And therefore, increasing prices may actually convince firms to increase their production. But there is also another approach which would yield exactly the same result, and this is more Keynesian, when you say just simply that wages, and I mean nominal wages, are rigid. So that means that they are not going to adjust immediately. Now, if we rewrite then this profit function as real profit is then nothing else than profit divided by the price level. And that is then y minus the real wage, W over P times L, minus the real price of capital, rental price of capital, times the actual level of capital. So what's going to happen that when P increases, then you can see that because the W remains the same, in real terms, the price of labor, the real wages, are going to decrease. So from this perspective, we can say that in relative terms, production becomes cheaper, and this will also increase the profit of the firm. So there are here then two theories. One is based on informational asymmetry or information imperfections, and the second is going to be based on the rigidity of wages in the short run. And that means that we have now positively sloped SRAS. So then in the system, we must have a positively sloped SRAS. Now, what could cause a change in the price level? Now, there are different ways how finally you may experience a change in SRAS. So let's look now at the fact of a demand shock on the economy, and then you will see how the SRAS is going to play a role here. So we have the long run aggregate supply here, and we will always assume that the SRAS moves with this LRAS. But in this case, we will assume that the long run aggregate supply is not affected. Now, let's assume that there is a change in aggregate demand. So if there is an aggregate demand shock, then the AD will shift to the right, and that means that prices will go up. So this will cause then an inflationary gap, and you can see that the economy will start from the original equilibrium here and will go up to a short-term equilibrium. So this movement along the SRAS is because of nominal wage rigidity plus, of course, this informational asymmetry thing. So basically then you will have a short-run increase in GDP. So if we started with Y1 here, then we will have a Y2, and you can see that the price level went up from P1 to P2. Now, how would then the economy go back to the long-run equilibrium? So there are two ways. Either a negative demand shock happens, and if this negative demand shock is roughly of the same magnitude but with the opposite sign, so because this is a negative shock, it would be possible that this AD just goes back here, and basically we re-establish the equilibrium along the old AD, so then the economy would just go back. But what happens if the demand shock just simply stays? No, in that case, the SRAS is going to shift. Why? Because in the long run, the laborers and the unions will, of course, know that there was an increase in prices and a drop in real wages. So they will demand a raise in nominal wages, and that will happen. And that means that there will be a negative aggregate supply shock because the cost of production went up, and that is going to be a leftward shift of the SRAS. And then finally you will have the same GDP as before, but at a higher price level. So what else could happen with the SRAS? It is also possible that there is a shock in the supply. So we may have that we have a SRAS here, we have a AD here, and of course the LRAS here. So we again start from the initial long run equilibrium, and it is possible that, for example, the price of oil or other sources of energy increases. Now that will also be part of the cost, of course, so that would reduce the profitability of the firms, and you would expect again a rightward shift in the economy. And something similar could happen if the wages, nominal wages, increase faster than the prices. So there is a real wage increase in the economy that would also lead to the same. So now we have a new short-run equilibrium at a higher price level than before, but we have a lower GDP. So how would then the economy repair itself? Well, there are two ways how you could do something. Either the government or central bank does something to the aggregate demand. So a positive demand shock could theoretically get the economy back here. So this is one way, when actively the government restores the equilibrium. Another possibility could be that simply the aggregate supply shock will disappear, for example, because energy prices will normalize. Then no government intervention is necessary, because you can reestablish the equilibrium, and then the SRAS will just simply go back to its original position, and we will have now again P1 price level and Y1 output. So depending on the situation, the SRAS may actually start with a shift, but whether it shifts back, well, it depends on the situation. The SRAS actually here may shift back because, for example, the energy prices go back to normal. But it is also possible that the economy will somehow adapt itself to the new situation, and for that reason the cost of productions will again go down, and then the SRAS may still shift back. So what happens then if we combine shocks in LRAS with SRAS? So we have here again the AS-AD system with an LRAS, SRAS, and AD, of course. Now we can imagine a situation when, for example, the LRAS increases, we should wait a minute because there was some lag in the computer. So what happens when, for example, technology moves the LRAS, technological development moves the LRAS to the right? And what is important, that we will always say that the SRAS shifts together with the LRAS, so it's back to the LRAS. This actually might be different in different courses, because you could imagine a situation when only LRAS increases and SRAS does not. But this would mean basically that there is technological development in the economy of which the firms actually use nothing. So that sounds to me a quite strange situation. That's why I always teach this in this way. So LRAS and SRAS are packed together. And no, the new situation is going to be here. So we have a new short-run equilibrium where, because the aggregate demand did not increase, we have a situation of a deflationary gap. So we have a higher GDP than before, but also at lower prices. And you can see that basically here we are not in a long-run equilibrium. So how could you bring the economy to a long-run equilibrium? There are basically many ways. What you can do is to increase AD. So one option could be to have an expansion in the AD, and then, as we already discussed earlier, you could bring the economy back to the new higher equilibrium and at a higher price level perhaps than before, or even at the same price level like in this case in the graph. But of course it is also possible that you don't do anything. If you don't do anything, then sooner or later the workers are going to experience unemployment, because when the economy is here, that means that actually the actual output is less than the potential output. So there is an unemployment in the economy. And because of that unemployment, the nominal wages will slowly start to decline. So the workers and the unions will need to accept lower nominal wages. And if that happens, then actually the short-run aggregate supply curve is going to shift to the right, and then the new equilibrium will again be at Y2 at an even lower P3 level of prices than before. So I hope you could follow these explanations. There are actually many ways of different interpretation of different shocks in the economy. It is important, however, when you make an assumption, then you clearly state it. Thank you.